Good afternoon, welcome to another A-Push video with Mr. Pate for Barlow High School. Today we're looking at the Cold War under Truman. The first topic we're going to talk about is Yalta. Yalta, which of course happens during World War II, one of the last conferences, they're going to have some things that they're figuring out. They being Churchill, FDR, and Stalin. And one of the things Stalin says, I need a buffer zone in Eastern Europe, I need some protection, but he promises free and unfettered elections, as they say. And that essentially meant he would let the people democratically vote for whatever kind of government they wanted. This satisfied Roosevelt, even though his advisors were telling him Stalin's not to be trusted. So what you're going to see essentially is the map is going to get divided because the Soviet Union ends up with control after World War II of Poland, the eastern sector of Germany, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Romania, and Bulgaria. And Albania, which I don't even have labeled down here, but it's there as well. So, and then again, Yugoslavia is its own communist country. So you can see when Winston Churchill, who is now the former Prime Minister of Great Britain after World War II, when he comes in and says in Missouri, an iron curtain has fallen across Europe, this is what he's talking about. Instead of rebuilding these countries and helping them to have these free elections and go their own way, he takes this control and basically just solidifies his power and grip over these countries in Eastern Europe. So that is what's going on with Yalta. And he says, I need this permanent buffer zone. Why does he feel he needs this? He's saying, I've been invaded twice in less than 50 years by the Germans. No more. I need a defensive perimeter so that if they attack, they're not even going to get into the Soviet Union. That's basically what he's saying. At the same time, on the other side, you have the United States, who is saying, you promised these elections, you're not living up to them in good faith, and the United States is going to be investing in rebuilding countries. And we'll certainly, Japan, they're going to take the sole responsibility for rebuilding Japan, and it blossoms beautifully and becomes an economic powerhouse in short order. The United States, along with Britain and France, is going to establish West Germany and again rebuild it and then set it on its way and let it become a great powerful nation once again. Once it becomes clear what Stalin is doing with Eastern Europe, Truman is going to say we need to have a response to this. And when you have Czechoslovakia, which does not want to be communist, tries to rebel, and then Soviet-sponsored communists are going to come in, take out the government, force it to become a communist country. Essentially, the Congress of the United States, the people of the United States see something strong must be done. They join Truman. So this idea of containment is we cannot allow communism to spread. Remember, the goal of communism, as we've talked about before when we looked at the Red Scare after World War I, was a worldwide takeover of communism. And you'll hear more about that hopefully you've listened to the podcast already and heard some of that. Kind of the different ideology that the Soviets had with this. They want everybody taken over. Well, with that, that's obviously going to lead to a fierce response. So for the United States, containment is providing some sort of assistance. And the Truman Doctrine specifically, as there is an attempt, I don't have Greece labeled up here, but as there's an attempt to have communist guerrillas take over Greece as well, when that occurs, this is going to launch, between the Czech, basically, coup and the attempts in Greece, the two of those things together lead Congress to support giving a lot of money. And so, basically, arming, giving money to, financial aid, whatever it would take to Western European or Southern European countries that are allies to help them not fall to communism. So many countries were just physically in shambles and economically in shambles. Well, that's when communism appeals to people. No prosperous industrial country ever has an interest in communism. It's when countries are struggling and not able to get there. That's when they're teetering on economic collapse. That's when communism is appealing to people. Or when they're a peasant population that has nothing left to lose, as we saw with Russia. So the Marshall Plan is going to be the next thing that follows up. The Truman Doctrine was saying give them kind of military and economic aid. But the Marshall Plan says you have to agree to be trade partners of the United States. The podcast that hopefully you've already listened to talks about the Bretton Woods Conference and the attempts to economically realign the world in a way that would create more stability and avoid wars. Hopefully you've heard about that. If not, maybe you should pause this and listen to the podcast and make more sense. Essentially, the Marshall Plan said any countries that agreed to do trade with the United States and have free trade and stay democratic, we would give them money. Now, some of the Eastern European countries, especially Czechoslovakia, wanted to take this and were not allowed to by the Soviets. The Soviets didn't want them doing free trade. They wanted them only trading with the Soviet Union and helping them out. So you're going to see all of these Western European countries and Southern European countries, they're going to get essentially this economic assistance through the Marshall Plan. It's not money that they have to pay back. It is just grants. Now, one thing that's going to help the United States even further is the Marshall Plan money had to be spent with U.S. companies doing the rebuilding or supplying them for the rebuilding. So it helps to enrich in the United States. But if you had nothing, I'm sure you would be okay with having someone else come in if they profited somewhat, if they're just giving you free money. Okay? So that's the Marshall Plan. The Berlin crisis. As things start to tighten up and get frosty in relations here, Berlin is this little star, I don't know if you can see it right above my finger here in East Germany. It was completely within the sector of East Germany. And Berlin was also divided into 4 zones, just like you had 3 zones of what became West Germany plus the East German zone the Soviets had. With that being the case, essentially, Stalin at one point just says, we're closing the border, and that's it. No more transport. So they close off the rail line and the roads and don't allow any access. Truman is, as you will see throughout this, a theme of him is he is not going to give any ground. He's an anti-appeasement type of guy. So he starts the Berlin airlift. It's a good move. He is not sitting there saying, we're going to basically attack and force our way in or something like that. He just says civilian planes are going to be flying over doing drops. And of course that puts the ball in the court of the Soviets. Are they going to shoot down these planes full of just supplies? They choose not to wisely. And then basically the United States is going to spend, I think, 277 days, about a year, basically, flying missions every day to keep people fed and in some sort of a acceptable situation. And finally, without saying anything, Stalin one day just opens the border and gives in on that. That's seen as kind of a mini victory for the United States. That's the Berlin crisis and airlift. NATO. NATO is going to be formed now, and essentially looking at kind of the Soviet threat and how the Soviets are, so far from the United States across the Atlantic Ocean. Soviets have a massive land army and tanks, etc. And the thought was, you know what, they could roll in and take down the rest of Germany or some other country and then be entrenched, and you'd have to either accept that or be facing World War III. So as a preventative measure and a protective measure, the United States and Canada, along with Western Europe, form NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. And NATO essentially is an attack against one by the communists would be an attack against all. So even if you are, Holland, if you get attacked, everybody's in, and this was seen as a great way to, a preventative measure that would certainly stop Stalin and make him think twice. It would make him not want to do that. Now, Stalin's response, I don't have up here, his response to NATO is the Warsaw Pact. Warsaw in Poland, they basically form a response and say, wait a minute, you got a big alliance? Now keep in mind, this is a defensive alliance designed to deter an attack. But Stalin says, well, we don't want to be attacked, so he forms the Warsaw Pact with all of these countries and the Soviet Union that attack on one would be attack on all. Pretty pointless because the whole point of the NATO one was to protect against an invasion. But I think you get that at this point. So that's basically what's going on with World War. That's what's going on with the Cold War during the Truman years in Europe. Okay, so we're talking about China now. China is going to be the largest population in the world of a country at that time. It still is today. And when China falls, it's much bigger than this comparatively to North Korea and South Korea. So work with me. When it falls to communists, led not by Soviet invasion occupying force, but by, like the Soviet Union itself, a peasant-led resistance movement that eventually overthrows it, That's just seen as a big psychological blow to the United States, and that, but it's just another episode of communism spreading. And again, that's the fear. That's what containment was all about, stopping. So this shows a limitation of containment. Now that leads us to the Korean War, and I've already drawn some things in here, so I'll try to explain what whoa, different map. Okay. So I'm going to go ahead and show you a couple of different things here. First, North Korea, which we talked about at the end of World War II. The agreement between the Allies was the Soviet Union would enter the war against Japan 90 days after the surrender of Germany. They do so. Not only are they ready to go, but now Stalin's like, licking his chops. Hey, more territory for me to take over. So as soon as that happens, the Soviet troops start rolling into North Korea, taking over some Japanese islands over here. They disputed with Russia for a long time, and by the time Nagasaki's occurred and the Japanese surrender, they get down to about the 38th parallel. And the U.S. has control of the southern portion, they have control of the northern portion, and that's kind of how things settle out. With the tacit blessing of Stalin, and certainly having lots of military support from the Soviets, that they had given them massive amounts of equipment and tanks, guns, planes, they're going to launch a surprise attack down to South Korea. This surprise attack, well, it's a surprise. And very quickly they overrun the South Korean forces. Truman goes to the United Nations and asks for a UN force to stop this and to save South Korea. And it succeeds. Now, some of you might be saying, well, wait a minute. You've had a 15-person security council, 15-country security council. 5 of those countries are permanent members, including now Communist China and Communist Soviet Union. Why would they let the United Nations come do this? There's 2 reasons. Number one, the United States, they vetoed letting Communist China be considered, the People's Republic of China, be considered the legitimate government of the people. So they didn't allow China to be seated yet at the UN as the legitimate government of those people. Because of that, the Soviet Union boycotts the UN for a while, and that means neither of them are there to veto the U.S.'s action. So it's a unanimous decision without them there to save South Korea. General Douglas MacArthur, hero of World War II, coming up from Australia, I shall return, all that stuff. He is going to come in and take over. They're down to almost nothing. This is all the territory. They've got this little corner here that is darkened. But he goes over and launches a surprise assault at Incheon, and this is up near the original border. They're going to do a pincer movement and basically kind of trap and create disarray between the North Korean forces and South Korea. And quickly they get a retreat. Within 2 weeks they've cleared out South Korea, and they're going to keep pushing up north. And now the question becomes, what do we do now? MacArthur says, take all of it, and that becomes the war aim. Truman says, yes, and tells the American people, we will do that. We will reunify Korea in a good way. But as he gets closer and closer, some people start to tell Truman, hey, if he goes all the way up to the border, the Chinese are going to attack. They have massive amounts of troops poised right here on the border. Now, MacArthur's solution is, we're going all the way up, and if they start to come in, we're just laying a nuclear belt of radioactivity by launching tons of A-bombs on China along this area, and they won't be able to come in, and we'll rout them. We'll cut off their supply lines and take out their troops and just make sure they'll never come through there. And again, keep in mind, people don't know that much about like the long-term effects of atomic radioactivity, but that's what his plan was. If you're thinking that's crazy, it was crazy. So Truman says we're not doing that. When MacArthur threatens to use them and tells China they better Korea they better surrender and the Chinese better stay out, that is where he's going to be relieved of command by Truman, which is kind of a triumph of the civilian commander-in-chief position of the president over the military command, which is important to maintain our democracy. So, well, being a republic that is democratic, that is. So, the Chinese do invade because MacArthur had gone ahead and gotten too close before he's relieved, and they push down, and then you end up with a stalemate that's pretty darn close to the 38th parallel original border. And this is where it sits in a stalemate. Truman doesn't know what to do. He had promised to take all of it. Now he can't. And you're in the stalemate. And so Eisenhower is going to campaign in 1952 on the idea that he will get the United States out of the war. Truman hadn't been able to finish this off. And so Truman, because he becomes very unpopular because of being unable to finish it off, he says he's not going to run again. So Eisenhower wins, and he is going to negotiate it into the Korean War, which basically changes nothing. It's like the War of 1812, just a big do-over with a lot of loss of life. And that's the Cold War under Truman. Stay classy, Sam Harlow.